Welcome, travelers of the night, to this calm space where the shadows invite us on a journey through time and imagination. Don't forget to leave a comment and a subscription. We'd love to know where you're joining us from on this journey. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Let your mind relax, your eyelids gently close, and prepare to dream awake with tales of old. Tonight, we'll delve into the echoes of a distant era, a time when faith and fear walked hand in hand and whispers could weave unbreakable destinies. We won't seek the roar of battles, nor the gleam of crowns. Instead, we'll pause in the forgotten corners of history, in the sensations that floated in the air, in the cautious glances exchanged at dusk. We'll immerse ourselves in the whispers of ancient forests, in the murmur of rivers that have been silent witnesses, and in the crackle of bonfires that illuminated more than just darkness, revealing shadows that played with perception. We'll journey to 15th century Europe, to a time of mystery and dim light, where a book, an object of leather and parchment, cast a shadow longer than any castle tower. A book known to few, feared by many, and which today, in the quiet of your rest, we'll seek to understand through its most subtle echoes. It won't be a horror story to startle you, but a melancholic exploration of how belief in the unseen shaped lives, how innocence could vanish under the weight of suspicion, and how the perception of magic, both beneficial and harmful, became intertwined with human destiny. We'll drift between reality and dream, perceiving the textures of the past, the emotions that clung to the air like morning mist, a reminder that history isn't just read, but felt. Breathe deeply, let these images dissolve into the air, and prepare to delve a little deeper into the mysteries of that age. Chapter 1. The Village Under the Veiled Gaze. A small village stretches through the misty valleys of the heart of Europe, its timber and mud brick houses huddled by a river that meanders lazily towards the sea. Straw roofs sag with the weight of winters. Chimneys breathe out smoke that smells of burnt wood and the promise of warmth. Fishermen mend their nets. Farmers work their barley fields. Artisans with calloused hands shape wood and iron. Life flows with the slowness of the river waters, marked by the sun ascending each day and the distant yet comforting chime of the small church bells. Their sounds scatter through the cold morning air, a familiar lullaby that has accompanied generations, mingling with the crow of the first roosters and the distant bleating of sheep on the hillsides. Dogs roam the dirt streets, cats stretch in the sun on windowsills, and the murmur of daily life is a constant soothing melody. The air carries the scent of damp earth after rain, of freshly baked bread wafting from the bakery, and sometimes the sweet and mysterious aroma of herbs drying on windowsills. These herbs, gathered by the village women, some known as wise women, were for infusions that calmed coughs, for poultices that eased aches, or to soothe toothache with a thick fir resin balm. People came to them with respect, seeking solace in their ancient knowledge. Their old hands, sometimes stained by earth and wild berry juice, carried knowledge passed down through generations, a wisdom that felt as natural as the flowing river and as ancient as the rocks forming the foundation of their homes. Children with rosy cheeks from the fresh air and bright, curious eyes would sit at their feet, fascinated by tales of enchanted forests and the little household spirits that sometimes played at hiding shiny objects, only to return them days later in an unexpected spot. Their laughter then was as clear as spring water, a sound of pure innocence that resonated through the valleys, unaware that the world would soon begin to demand a price for that very innocence. In those days, the line between the known and the arcane was blurred, almost non-existent. Every shadow in the forest, every whisper of the wind could be the presence of a spirit, a playful fairy, or, for some, something less benign. A night creature that fed on human despair, a goblin that led travelers astray, or a banshee foretelling death. Tales of old legends mingled with Christian faith, creating a tapestry of beliefs where magic, both perceived and real, had an undeniable place in daily life. If a cow gave more abundant milk, thanks were given to heaven, but also a small offering of bread and salt was left at the crossroads just in case some forest being had intervened. If a fever subsided, prayers were thanked, but the wise woman's herbs were also praised, and murmurs about her power spread. It was a world where the pragmatic and the mystical coexisted in a precarious peace woven with threads of reverence and an ancient mystery, a balance as fragile as the spiderweb shimmering with morning dew and as vulnerable as the last snowflake before spring. Life was hard, and people clung to any hope, any explanation, no matter how strange. Dawn, which once promised only the arduous labor of the day, now brought with it a new shadow, a new fever, not of the body, but of the spirit, was rumored to be spreading from village to village. Clerics in pulpits spoke with a growing solemnity about the evil one, not as a distant figure, but as an active presence, weaving intrigues in the hearts of communities, corrupting souls and minds. Old stories of sorcerers and witches, once mere tales to frighten disobedient children on stormy nights, began to take on a new life, a tint of truth that chilled the blood, a poetic harshness that painted reality with dark strokes. Whispers from travelers brought tales of strange trials in distant lands, of confessions under duress, of diabolical signs found in the most unexpected places. A mole, a scar, a gaze too fixed. The word witchcraft began to be uttered with a new intonation, a shiver that didn't come from the cold, but from an unease that seeped through the cracks of security, an unspoken question hanging in the air. What if that darkness was already here, among us, disguised as a neighbor or a friend? Children who once ran freely until dusk, chasing fireflies or playing hide and seek among the barns, are now called home when the last light of the sun fades. A small gesture that, nevertheless, reveals a new layer of caution, a fear that once only existed in the darkest tales. Lantern light in windows became a barrier, and a lullaby felt like a shield, a fragile defense against the unknown. Glances in the tavern, where boisterous laughter and goblin tales were once shared, now grow longer, more inquisitive, weighing each word before it was spoken. The old carefree laughter had given way to a new one tinged with nervousness and doubt, a nervous cough that stifled chuckles, as if joy itself were a sin. Doors closed earlier, windows were covered with heavy cloths, and the silence of the night seemed laden with an unknown weight, a grim anticipation floating over the thatched roofs. Even dreams seemed to grow more vivid and restless, mirroring the daytime anxiety, filled with blurred figures and incomprehensible whispers. The village, which once felt like a warm embrace, began to feel like a cage. It's as if a fog, not of water, but of suspicion, had begun to cover the village, making every face a little more distant, every gesture a little more calculated. The elders, seated by the fire, murmur about the ship of suspicion arriving in port, bringing with it not exotic goods, but an invisible cargo of distrust. And at the center of that cargo, though no one names it aloud yet, floats the idea of a book, a voluminous tome bound in dark leather and covered in almost century-old dust. A book not read in daylight, but in the dimness of candles, where shadows danced and words took on a life of their own. Enigmatic stories of its power are whispered like a sacred and terrible secret, an ancestral fear that seeps into the subconscious, like persistent dampness in an old cellar. Its pages, it was said, were made of skin so thin it was barely felt, and the ink so black it seemed to absorb light, making the words themselves take on a dark aura. The leather binding, thick and rough to the touch, resembled dead skin, and the rancid smell emanating from it clung to the fingers of anyone who dared to leaf through it, a fragrance of old damnation. People, in their simplicity, couldn't grasp the complexity of councils or distant edicts. They only felt the cold in the air, the shift in glances. Faith, once an unwavering comfort, began to mix with superstitious dread, a poetic harshness revealing the fragility of their hope. Every misfortune, once attributed to divine will or bad luck, could now have a darker, more personal origin. The old cow that gave no milk, the youngest child's fever, the mill that broke down without reason, everything could be a sign, a whisper of the devil in a neighbor's ear. And in that search for signs, the community unknowingly began to unravel piece by piece, like an old tapestry in the sun that tears with every gust of wind. The echo of strange laughter, a word whispered on the wind, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, all became a piece in a puzzle of paranoia that the mind itself created, a grim play where every neighbor could unknowingly be an actor or a victim in an endless tragedy. Life, once a simple dance, had become an intricate waltz of distrust. The night wind, which once lulled dreams, now seemed to carry echoes of suspicion, whispers of accusation. Dogs in yards barked without apparent reason at the darkness, and villagers clung tighter to their crucifixes and old prayers, seeking protection against a threat they felt in the air but couldn't name with certainty. The silence of the countryside, once a blessing, now felt heavy, full of the possibility of the invisible, the incomprehensible. The world seemed to shrink, more claustrophobic, encased beneath a mantle of fear that grew with each sunset. Even the sun, upon rising, seemed to do so with less enthusiasm, as if it knew of the darkness brewing below, a darkness that promised a new kind of justice. Chapter 2, The Book and the Three Shadows of Magic. In the heart of every village there were figures who knew the less traveled paths, not just those of the forest, but those of ancestral wisdom. Often they were women, old women with gnarled fingers and eyes that had seen many moons. Like Ilara, the village herbalist, whose cottage smelled of earth, rosemary, and the sweetness of thyme. Her laughter at times was a murmur of ironic humor, a quiet chuckle at human ailments, or the clumsiness of the young, a way to lighten life's burden. Ilara wasn't an evil witch. She was the one who cured children's coughs, who knew which plants to use to ease childbirth. Her magic, if one could call it that, was the magic of relief and compassion, a gift intertwined with life itself, with the cycles of nature and the well-being of the community. She was seen on misty mornings with her wicker basket, gathering dew from leaves and hidden roots, with an almost sacred reverence for the earth. Her expert hands could differentiate poison from cure with a certainty that many found unsettling. They watched her with an awe tinged with apprehension, for her power, though beneficial, was alien to the books and sermons of the church, and that, in times of fear, became a double-edged sword. The morning mist that enveloped her cottage was nothing more than mist, but to fearful minds it became a veil concealing ancient rites, a portal to knowledge that the church condemned, and a source of mystery that grew ever darker. Elara moved with the silent grace of a forest creature. She knew the secrets of every stream that meandered through the land, of every tree that raised its branches to the sky, of every flower that bloomed in spring, of every insect that buzzed in the grass. Her remedies were not divine miracles, but the patience of nature and the accumulated knowledge of generations of women who had healed their families with what the earth offered, a legacy of healing passed down from mother to daughter. But the very knowledge that made her valuable also made her vulnerable. Could a woman know so much without having made a pact with something? That question, once laughable, now floated in the air like the spores of a poisonous mushroom, ready to germinate in fear, and the scent of her herbs, once curative, could be interpreted as the stench of a spell. The irony of her existence was that she saved lives, but people, in their growing fear, saw her as a danger. Her smile, once a balm, could now be interpreted as a grimace, her silence as a mysterious enchantment. Her deep, wise eyes, which saw beyond the obvious, became evidence, and the murmur of children around her a chorus of innocence that would be silenced by the shadow of the hammer. The breeze that swayed the herbs in her window, once a breath of life, became the breath of suspicion, a whisper that would condemn her. But not all who were named sorcerers or witches engaged in acts of kindness. Popular belief, fueled by sermons and whispered tales by the fire, spoke of those who did seek power in the shadows, of those said to make dark pacts, to sow disease in livestock or misfortune in homes. These were the malevolent sorcerers to whom withered harvests and inexplicable illnesses were attributed. Their existence, or the belief in it, fueled a more primal fear, a deep unease that justified the search for a drastic solution. The darkness they promised, a darkness believed to be as palpable as a moonless night, became the justification for terror. There was, for instance, the tale of old Margot, a solitary woman who lived on the outskirts, near the swamp where fireflies danced with a macabre light on moonless nights. She was blamed not only for the droughts that withered the fields, for the sour milk that curdled children's stomachs, for the inexplicable illnesses that took the elderly, but it was rumored that her cottage was a nest of snakes and toads, that her candles burned with a greenish flame, and that the air around her became cold and heavy. Her eyes, they said, held a strange glint like dying embers, and her old hands seemed capable of weaving curses into the very air with a gesture as imperceptible as a bat's flutter. People avoided her, whispered her name in dread, and every misfortune in the village reinforced the belief in her evil, a perceived darkness that the hammer sought to eradicate. Her laughter, if heard, was a shiver down the spine, a dark humor born of knowing she was feared, a secret well guarded between her and the wind, a hollow echo lost in the fields, a ghostly lament of the souls she was said to have trapped. Sometimes, children who dared to pass near her cottage swore they had seen strange lights dancing in her windows on the darkest night, and had heard guttural chants that chilled the blood, though never loud enough to wake their parents. The mere mention of her name was enough for a mother to cross herself and lock the door, and for men to ensure cold iron protected their thresholds, engraving crosses into wooden beams. Margot was the personification of an ancient fear, a specter lurking on the periphery of the village's sanity, a figure carved by collective paranoia itself, a shadow moving between the real world and that of nightmares, a story told in hushed tones, but with wide, fearful eyes. She was a living legend of malevolence, a convenient receptacle for all the ills that befell the community, a twisted monument to their own anxieties. And then there are the others, the vast majority, the innocent, those who, like the carpenter Thomas or his wife Martha, lived simple lives marked by honest labor and faith. They knew nothing of herbs, spells, or pacts. Their only magic was the love for their family and the sweat of their brow, the constancy of their effort day after day. Their hands, which built and repaired, were the hands of the community. Their laughter, the sound of normality. Yet, in the charged atmosphere of the time, a neighbor's dispute, envy over a good harvest, or even a peculiarity in their behavior could transform into a devastating accusation. The melancholy of this situation is that the line between piety and paranoia became invisible, devouring lives indiscriminately. It was a macabre lottery of fate, where innocence was not a defense, but at times an invitation to suspicion. Who could sleep soundly knowing that a simple misstep, a misunderstanding, a shadow at the window could seal their destiny? Injustice was woven into the finest threads of life, invisible until it was too late. Thomas's nightly sighs beside his wife Martha were not from the day's weariness, but from the weight of uncertainty, the bitter taste of fear that seeped even into the sweetest dreams. His hands, once strong and sure, now trembled as he lit a candle, fearing that the dancing flame would reveal something ominous. The bed, once a refuge, became a place of silent vigil, where every external sound was a potential threat, and the whisper of the wind outside seemed to carry accusations. The Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, was written precisely for this: to differentiate, to classify, to give a name and form to these shadows that people perceived. Its pages, densely written in Latin, spoke not of fairy tale magic, but of a real pact with darkness. It described how to recognize the signs of the impious, how to interrogate suspects, how to eradicate witchcraft from the face of the earth. Its reading, regardless of its content, was a grim, almost meditative experience, thick as mist itself, laden with the weight of unshakable conviction. The scent of old parchment and stale ink rose from its pages like a cold vapor clinging to the reader's consciousness. Whoever held it, it was said, could feel the weight of thousands of souls on their hands, a chilling touch that promised power over the most feared. Its illustrations, if it had any, were dark and etched with obsessive precision, showing figures with empty eyes and gnarled fingers, a vision of depravity that the book insisted on combating, a gallery of horrors etched for posterity. Every paragraph was a sentence, every phrase a condemnation, weaving a web of accusations as perfect as it was deadly, a legal labyrinth with no escape for the unfortunate. This book became a tool, a guide for inquisitors who firmly believed they were serving a divine cause. They did not see women like Alara, the herbalist, but as a possible manifestation of evil, a threat disguised as good. Perception was the key, and the hammer offered the lenses through which to see. Its power resided not in magic, but in the authority granted to it, in its ability to transform fear into organized persecution. An irrefutable logic for the time, as unyielding as cathedral stone, where reason bent to faith, and faith was nourished by terror, an eternal cycle of suspicion and condemnation. The only logic that existed was that of accusation, and the only truth was that dictated from the high stand with a solemnity that turned cruelty into divine justice. The smoke from the bonfires, though invisible in the distance, seemed to seep into the air, a ghostly warning of what the book could unleash. Chapter 3. The Echo of Silence and the Weight of Accusation. When the seed of fear takes root, the known world transforms. Conversations by the fire, once filled with anecdotes of the harvest or market gossip, now revolve around cases. At first, names weren't spoken. They were just tales of what had happened in the next village. Stories whispered with wide eyes and low voices. But each story carried a weight, a warning, an unease that settled in the chest like a cold stone. The night shadows, once friends, now seemed to hide watchful glances, and the creak of wood in the neighboring house could sound like the first step of an impending trial. The very air grew thick, laden with whispers of distrust, a cold breath that seeped under every closed door. The sun set with an almost painful slowness, casting ominous shadows over the cobblestones, promising a night filled with anxiety. The Malleus Maleficarum was a book that promised to unmask evil, but in its rigor, in its relentless method, it often unmasked human desperation, ignorance, and fear. Its pages not only spoke of the nature of witches, but gave precise instructions for their detection and sentencing. And in a world where plague, bad harvests, or infant death were inexplicable to most, the temptation to find a cause, a scapegoat, was immense. At times, the village itself became an invisible prison, its inhabitants walking on eggshells, fearful of every gesture, every word, every sigh that might be misinterpreted. The logic of paranoia spread like a disease, and proof became as malleable as clay in a potter's hands, shaped by the fear of the crowd and the desperation of the accusers. Truth, once a solid rock, turned into sand, slipping through fingers, while lies, fueled by panic, rose like an impregnable tower, watching with empty eyes. The solitude a man must feel seeing the shadow of suspicion fall upon his wife, upon his daughter. A farmer, with hands hardened by the plow, whose life is based on earth and honesty, suddenly finds himself in a labyrinth of accusations. His love, his loyalty, clash against a wall of collective fear. The melancholy of those times lies not only in death, but in the fragmentation of trust, in the loss of faith in one's own community. It is a silent pain, an echo of the sadness that lodges in the souls of those who see their loved ones dragged away by a tide of unfounded accusations. The very air seemed to grow denser, laden with unuttered sighs and the laments of broken hearts. An invisible weight floating over every home, the promise of rest at the end of the day turned into a vigil, where the thought of a loved one in danger kept the mind in a tormented state of half-sleep. Nights grew longer, colder, and sleep was a luxury few could afford, invaded by nightmares of chains, accusing glances, and the relentless logic of torment that promised the truth. Candles flickered with fear, and shadows lengthened, dancing with the deepest doubts. Consider Isabel the young spinner. Her fingers were quick, her song sweet. She knew nothing of herbs or spells, only of the spinning wheel and the loom. But her beauty, unusual for the village, and her refusal to marry a man she didn't love, made her an easy target. One day, a neighbor's cattle inexplicably fell ill. The accusation was not long in coming. Isabel the innocent found herself caught in a whirlwind of questions and accusing glances. Her youth and free spirit became evidence against her. Her story is a silent lament for the purest injustice, a frayed thread in the tapestry of life, unraveling before the eyes of those who loved her. The irony was as cruel as an endless winter. Her very innocence and uniqueness became her condemnation. Her laughter, once vibrant, was now just a memory that haunted her parents' dreams, a ghostly echo of what had been. The cruelty was not the visible torture, but the implacable and inescapable logic of condemnation, where every answer was a trap, and truth was worthless. Her gaze, filled with confusion as deep as the village wells, met only the harshness of strange faces, the indifference of those who judged, and the cold silence of the room. Her voice, which once wove melodies, was now barely a whisper, choked by fear, a moan lost in the vast solitude of accusation. Shackles, though invisible, already tightened around her ankles. On the other hand, the shadow of old Margot loomed over the village. Her eyes, they said, held a strange glint, like dying embers, and her old hands seemed capable of weaving curses into the very air. She was blamed for droughts, for sour milk, for inexplicable illnesses. People avoided her, whispered her name in dread, and every misfortune in the village reinforced the belief in her evil. The hammer, for many, was the only hope of ridding themselves of the perceived darkness that Margot represented. Her last days, shrouded in hostility, must have been a macabre dance between solitude and the confirmation of the village's superstitions. A cruel irony. The darkness people feared perhaps only existed in their own minds, a distorted reflection of their own fears. But for the community, she was the embodiment of malevolence, a malevolent mystery that had to be crushed. Her trial, if it could be called that, was a farce as predictable as dawn, where condemnation was written before the first word was spoken. Perhaps, in her last moments, Margot cast a look of pure dark humor at the crowd, a silent joke about the blindness of her accusers, before the veil of the end covered her. Her cottage, now empty, remained a silent witness, with the smell of dampness and an ancient sorrow that would never quite dissipate, a monument to credulity and terror. Even the ravens, who used to perch on her roof, seemed to have abandoned her, leaving an even heavier silence. And sometimes, in the midst of this oppression, a small spark of humor emerges, an ironic comfort. Perhaps a villager, in a moment of despair, shares a ridiculous anecdote about an overly pompous inquisitor tripping over his own robe in the mud, or an absurd detail that momentarily lightens the weight of fear. These are the silent laughs, the bitter smiles shared in the darkness, a small act of resistance against the crushing solemnity, a reminder of life's persistence even in the darkest moments, like a small mockery of destiny weaving such complicated threads. The inquisitors themselves, with all their seriousness and Latin phrases, were sometimes as absurd as the goblin tales their own wives told their children to sleep. The bureaucracy of evil, with its seals and parchments, had its own twisted comedy, a grim play where each character acted their part with a seriousness bordering on the ridiculous. Blind to their own farce, the trial minutes, full of fantastic accusations and outlandish evidence, were, in retrospect, documents of a tragic comedy, as hilarious as they were heartbreaking. The deepest fear is not of fire, but of the word of a neighbor, the testimony of a frightened child, the accusation of an enemy. The Malleus Maleficarum grants these words unshakable authority, transforming local superstitions into undeniable truths. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blur, and the collective mind sinks into a dreamlike state of paranoia where any peculiarity, any misfortune, can be proof of an invisible conspiracy, whether real or fabricated. It was a mental labyrinth with no exit, where every thought became a potential trap, and the only escape was sleep, or perhaps the abyss of madness. The darkness resided not in witches, but in the human heart, capable of creating monsters where there were only shadows. The night breeze carried away the whispers of those who were no longer there, but left an echo, a persistent reminder of the fragility of existence. It is a time of contrasts, of unalterable natural beauty, with ancient forests and starry skies that invite awe, and at the same time of a human darkness born of fear and ignorance. The silence of the night, which once brought the promise of rest, can now be filled with the echo of uncertainty, the weight of a name whispered on the wind that cannot be unsaid, leaving a deep melancholy for broken lives. The moon, a silent accomplice, merely observed, its silvery light spilling over scenes of quiet and terror alike, without judging, only illuminating the raw reality of human nature. Chapter 5. The Silenced Voices and the Shadow of Ignorance. Life in the village continued, but under a veil of silence. Laughter was no longer as frank, encounters in the market briefer. Whispers replaced open conversations, and everyone became a little more guarded about their own thoughts. It was an invisible prison, woven with the threads of mutual distrust. The fear of being singled out took root as deeply as the roots of old oak trees, a constant unease that gnawed at the joy of living. People strove to display immaculate piety, not to stand out, to be as gray and anonymous as the dusty path leading to the mill. The fear of the unknown, of what the hammer represented, became an invisible burden that every soul carried on their shoulders, heavier than any sack of grain. In this atmosphere, ancient folk rituals, harmless to many, transformed into grounds for suspicion. The woman who placed a horseshoe over the door for good luck, the man who murmured an old rhyme to calm a frightened horse, even the grandmother who sang a lullaby with strange words inherited from pagan times, could find themselves under scrutiny. The line between tradition and heresy became blurred, a mystery that the Inquisition, with the help of the hammer, set out to unmask with relentless precision. It was a cruel irony. The very culture that had nourished these communities could now become their executioner, a dark humor that only fate could appreciate. People learned to erase their tracks, to disguise their small customs, to hide the amulets they once proudly displayed. Remember Elara, the herbalist? Her hands, once honored for curing little Hans's fever, were now subject to furtive glances. One day, a strange illness struck the Lord's flock of sheep. The mother's milk dried up, and the lambs, once lively, fell weak to the ground. In desperation, a fearful peasant's voice, barely a whisper, mentioned Elara's name. "Her herbs," he said, are very powerful. Who knows what else she can do? That night, Alara slept restlessly, her dreams a whirlwind of accusing faces and voices, murmuring which, a melancholy settling in her chest like a frost. Her wisdom, which was her life, had become her sentence. She felt like a stranger in the land she had nurtured. And in the halls of grand houses, of distant tribunals, the hammer rose not just as a book, but as an unshakable philosophy. Its authors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, had written it with the conviction of a divine mission. For them, every accused woman was a gateway to the devil's influence. The book not only justified torture, but considered it necessary to wrench truth from the clutches of demonic lies. The logic of the hammer was a net so intricate and tight that, once caught, it was almost impossible to escape. Every denial was proof of deception, every confession of victory for faith. It was a system as circular as a river's whirlpool, where the current always dragged you back to the same end point. Think of the interrogations, not as scenes of horror, but as long, exhausting sessions in the dim light. The accused, whether man or woman, sat before serious figures, wrapped in dark robes, their faces barely visible in the candlelight. Questions followed one after another, weaving a spiderweb of contradictions. Have you seen the devil? Have you flown by night? Have you harmed a neighbor with your words? And every denial, every hesitation was noted with a quill scratching parchment, like a spider weaving its web. The melancholy of that moment lay in the futility of resistance, in the certainty of a destiny already sealed long before the first question was uttered. The room smelled of candle wax, dampness, and the cold sweat of fear, a scent that lingered in the memory of the few who emerged alive. Confessions often were the product of desperation, the last refuge of an exhausted mind. They were sad poems of what people were willing to say for the torment to end, to find a moment of peace amidst the maelstrom. They were tales of improbable night flights, of packs with horned and tailed creatures, of Sabbaths under the moon where one danced naked in circles. Viewed today, these accounts contain a dark humor in their absurdity, a grotesque theatricality that clashes with the grim reality of their origin. People confessed to escape pain, not to tell the truth, and the inquisitors in turn saw in these fantasies the confirmation of their wisdom and the victory of their book. It was a macabre dance of beliefs and convenience, where truth was the first victim sacrificed on the altar of fear. Chapter 6. The cleansing fire and the ashes of community. Fear and suspicion, once sown, grew with the speed of weeds in the field. Accusation fell not only on the individual, but on their family, their friends, their lineage. It was a silent contagion, a disease that devoured trust. Men who had shared bread and wine in the tavern now avoided each other's gaze. Mothers who had helped each other in childbirth now whispered about their neighbors' peculiarities. The village, once an extension of family, became a viper's nest, where betrayal could come from the most unexpected hand. The moment of trial was not an act of justice, but a grim, predictable ritual. The village square, normally vibrant with market chatter, became a silent, tense stage. The crowd gathered not out of morbid curiosity, but from a complex web of fear, the need to see evil excised, and perhaps a secret unease of knowing they themselves could be next. The melancholy of the scene was not in the punishment, but in the silence of the spectators, a silence that weighed more than 1,000 words, a testament to the power of terror. The church bells rang not to call to prayer, but to announce an end. Think of the moment Ilara, the herbalist, was brought before the men of God. Her old, gnarled hands, which had healed so many, were now bound. Her wise eyes, which had read the secrets of the forest, now saw only stern faces and eyes full of condemnation. The charge, having used her herbs not for good, but to pact with demons, to dry up cows' milk, and to wither women's wombs. A brutal irony, almost a dark humor of fate, that her gift of healing became her own cross. She offered no defense, only a look of profound sadness toward the sky, as if asking nature to judge her. Her silence was a cry more powerful than any lament. Her story became an echo of all the good witches who were misunderstood and crushed by the weight of ignorance. And in the case of old Margot, condemnation was a certainty written in the air before the inquisitors even arrived in the village. The tales of her malevolent spells, of her profane dances under the moon, had become ingrained in the village's soul. Her solitary figure, her aversion to company, her peculiar way of speaking to ravens all added to the evidence. Her last walk through the dirt streets before the purification was observed with a mixture of fear and relief. She, the embodiment of malevolent mystery, became the scapegoat for the community's misfortunes. Her sealed fate was a reminder to all: darkness exists, and the hammer is the only one who can combat it. Her departure left a void, but also a feeling of fragile peace, like the calm that follows a violent storm, a peace always on the verge of breaking. And then there were the innocent, like Isabel, the spinner. Her trial was a circus of cruelty, a game of words where truth was twisted until it became unrecognizable. Her beauty, once admired, became a devil's trap. Her refusal to accept her suitor, a sign of demonic obstinacy. Testimony piled up, fabricated by fear or envy. I saw her in the forest at dusk. A neighbor would say, "My child fell ill after she smiled at him." A mother would stammer. Isabel clung to hope, to logic, to the simple truth of her innocence. But the hammer knew no human logic, only divine. And in that logic, innocence was just a disguise. The melancholy in her gaze, as she understood there was no escape, was a mirror of the era's soul, a reflection of voiceless despair. Fire, which once symbolized warmth and life in homes, became the instrument of purification. Its crackle, which once lulled dreams, was now a grim reminder. But even in those final moments, there was a silence. Not a silence of surrender, but an internal silence of resistance. A silence that the hammer could never break. A sacred space where the truth of innocence, or the essence of wisdom, or even perceived malevolence, persisted beyond the flame. It was the poetic harshness of human existence, its ability to cling to what is, even when everything else crumbles. The ashes that flew with the wind were not just remnants of wood or bodies, but of trust, of community, of reason. They left a trail of melancholy that settled in the village air, a constant reminder of the price of fear. Families were left with the echo of an empty chair, of a name no longer spoken aloud, of a memory that hurt. The air smelled of smoke and a sorrow that would not easily dissipate. Chapter 7. The glimmers of magic and the distant light. Despite the terror the hammer sowed, the belief in magic, in the arcane, never completely disappeared. It hid, transformed, adapted. People, in the privacy of their homes, in the secrecy of the forests, continued to seek solace in herbs, in amulets, in old songs that whispered of invisible powers. It was a silent resistance, an act of faith in a world where official faith had become so terrifying. The wise women who managed to survive, or the new generations who learned in secret, continued their work, whispering their knowledge by candlelight in hidden corners where the hammer's echo did not reach. Elara the herbalist's wisdom was not entirely lost. Her daughters, her granddaughters, learned her secrets in the silence of the night, under the mantle of the stars. Plants continued to grow in the forest, streams continued to murmur their secrets, and people, though fearful, still sought relief when illness struck, or comfort when sorrow overwhelmed them. Her hands, once viewed with fear, were sought again, though now with even greater discretion. It was a fragile piece woven with the thread of human need, one that was woven in the clandestinity of the night, an act of faith in the inherent goodness of nature. It was a form of ironic humor from the universe that life persisted despite the madness of men. Even the tales of old Margot transformed over time. What was once pure terror began to acquire a tint of legend, a mystery that merged with the swamp mist. She was no longer such a palpable threat, but a tale to frighten children, a reminder of darkness, yes, but a darkness that was now part of folklore, not daily life. Peasants, passing near her abandoned cottage, would cross themselves, but also felt a strange fascination for the place, an awe for the power attributed to her, an echo of the fantasy that fear had created. Her story became a whisper on the wind, a warning, but also a legend. The hammer of witches, over the centuries, began to lose its edge. The light of reason, still dim, began to appear on the horizon, bringing with it new ways of thinking, new questions. The book, once the terror of the era, became a historical document, a grim testament to what happens when fear arms itself with misinterpreted knowledge and unlimited authority. Its shadow, however, never completely disappears. It transforms into an echo that today is perceived in the quiet of our own night, an echo of the voices that were silenced, of the tears that fell in secret, of the families that were separated, an echo of the belief in hidden forces, both those sought for evil and those practiced for good, and of the painful confusion that enveloped the innocent. This melancholy is not to sadden us, but to remind us of the fragility of justice and the importance of compassion and understanding. It invites contemplation, reflection on the forces that even today can manipulate truth and sow distrust. The whisper of history reminds us that truth, at times, is the first victim of fear, and that ignorance, when armed with power, can be more formidable than any spell. The wind, blowing through the centuries, still carries the silent laments of those who suffered, a symphony of echoes resonating in the depth of the night, calling us to remember and learn from the mistakes of a not-so-distant past. The ruins of old castles, centuries-old churches, forgotten roads, all hold the memory of those times. The wind blowing through their stones is the same wind that once carried whispers of suspicion, and today brings echoes of peace and learning. We feel a mystery in these places, a connection to the past, but no longer an oppressive fear, but one that inspires reflection, daydreaming about the complexity of human nature and the vast tapestry of history. Every stone, every dry branch, every shadow cast in the night. seems to whisper a part of that story, inviting us to listen with a calm heart and mind, and to find tranquility in understanding the cycles of time. The Hammer of Witches, in its terrible historical reality, left us a complex legacy. It teaches us about the power of an idea, the ease with which fear can be manipulated, and the silent strength of those who suffered, whether unjustly accused or those who sought wisdom in less conventional ways. In the end, it was not the hammer that prevailed, but the resilience of the human spirit, family love, and the innate need for compassion and understanding. May these echoes now dissolve into the promise of deep sleep. And so, as the stories of a forgotten time merge with the shadows of this night, we gently move away from the echoes of the hammer. We have walked paths of suspicion, felt the melancholy of injustice, and contemplated the persistence of human hope and the complex dance between the perception of good and evil in the magic of yesteryear. Let the last images of this journey dissolve like morning mist, transforming into soft clouds that float freely in your mind. May the calm we have woven with words and sounds envelop you completely, from the crown of your head to the tips of your toes. The journey has ended for today, but rest is just beginning. Feel your body relax even more with each breath. Feel the warmth and security of your own space. The stories are left behind, transforming into soft threads of dreams that your mind can explore freely without weight or worry. May this tranquility accompany you on your journey through the night towards deep and restorative sleep. May your mind be at peace and your spirit calm. Sweet dreams, and until next time, we meet in the realms of imagination and history.